starting back up, and then, so I'll start us off and then jump in,
Yeah.
because you know this probably better.
Yeah.
What happens when a police officer shoots a citizen in Idaho? What happens next?
Right. Well, when a police officer shoots a citizen in Idaho, they typically are going to be responding to some sort of law enforcement call. So it's in the course of exercising their appropriate law enforcement duties, in the sense that it's a call that they are responding to. And then it depends on, of course, where the shooting occurs. Typically, the investigation, the officer will be immediately put on administrative leave by his or her agency, and then an outside agency, one other than the one that the officer is employed by, will initiate an investigation into the incident. In addition, depending on the facts of the shooting, the FBI and my office and the Civil Rights Division may initiate a civil rights investigation. It's not automatic that the federal government will become involved when a law enforcement officer shoots a citizen, but oftentimes the FBI and the Civil Rights Division and my office will be involved in looking at that incident. Certainly, when there are indicia that the shooting was unusual, or that there was not a clear threat by all accounts to the officer's life, then my office will be involved, the Civil Rights Division will be involved, the FBI will be involved. And federally, the FBI is the agency that investigates those cases, and then on the prosecution side, the U.S. Attorney's offices and the Civil Rights Division criminal section of the Maine Justice Department have authority to prosecute the case or not prosecute the case, to review it for prosecution. I mean, the things that typically that we're going to look for when deciding to get involved, some of the surrounding facts may be, was the person who, the victim, the person who was shot, did they have a weapon? If it's an unarmed person, then that tends to be something that we'll look at, we're likely to look at. During the course of time I've been with the U.S. Attorney's Office, so let's say 18 years, and we've probably reviewed 6 to 10 officer-involved shooting cases throughout Idaho. When I was with the Civil Rights Division, the criminal section, probably 80% of the cases I reviewed were law enforcement officer cases, and probably 3 or 4 a year were officer-involved shooting cases. In those cases, there are some real practical issues that you have to look at. One is that in order to initiate an investigation, it's a relatively low threshold. If the facts, as alleged by a complainant, or if the basic facts set out, say, in the initial reports, would make out a violation of the federal criminal statute, then there will be an investigation. But then, because of the elements of the offense and the burden of proof that we have, so we have to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt, and the elements of the offense require us to prove that the law enforcement officer willfully or intentionally used more force than was necessary. So the officer at the time that he or she used the force knew that they didn't need to use that much force. Then that's what it takes to have a successful prosecution. So you can see the gulf between those two is really pretty big. Low standard to initiate an investigation, and a high standard to prosecute a case. And so that's why I think it's important in these cases that the state also look closely as to whether there would be a violation of state statutes, because the state statutes that are available may be, assaults, negligent homicide, manslaughter. There's a whole range of criminal statutes that may apply for the state in a certain situation, whereas the federal government really in those kinds of cases has probably really only that one statute, the 18 U.S.C. 242, which is the violation of a constitutional right by someone acting under color of law.
Did you want to jump in? Because I have some questions.
You can go ahead, sorry.
Okay, because I don't want to steamroll you. Okay, so you talked about the standards being very high for prosecution. Are the standards too high for prosecution?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, you have beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard in every criminal case, and that's absolutely appropriate. And then we want to make sure, law enforcement officers have a very difficult job to do, and appropriately, we expect them to do it exceedingly well. I mean, they often walk into situations where people are very dangerous. I mean, you never know for a police officer, when they roll up on a traffic stop, what's going on with the person operating the vehicle. There's a potential for danger. The law enforcement officer also has this responsibility and this public trust to treat people fairly and to not just randomly use force or treat people poorly. So it's a very difficult job that they're expected to do very, very well. And the statute that we have available to us is designed to prevent the abuse of that public trust. So if someone intentionally uses more force than is necessary, so if they know that they're doing a bad thing, then it's basically an abuse of public trust statute. That's what the federal statute is designed to do. For other kinds of violations, those state statutes are available, and the state can prosecute if they find that there is sufficient evidence as well. And that's why I think it's appropriate for both entities to look closely at those officer-involved shootings.
And the use of police force has been in the media spotlight nationally for about a year now. What do you think is missing from that conversation?
Well, I don't know that there is a lot, missing from that conversation. I think that the conversation needs to go on pretty consistently. I think that law enforcement officers and community members have really a responsibility to engage in constructive dialogues with one another. I think it's incumbent upon law enforcement generally to recognize that sometimes in the past and sometimes in some agencies, law enforcement officers have behaved badly, or law enforcement in general has behaved badly, and law enforcement and prosecutors' offices shouldn't shy away from that history. I mean, one of the things that Jim Comey, director of the FBI, does with his new agent class is take them to the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C., and they can talk about things like the FBI kept its eye on Martin Luther King Jr., was concerned about him. There were some abuses that went on by law enforcement. There are law enforcement agencies that have a history of using excessive force, that have a pattern and practice of constitutional violations. So I think law enforcement has to acknowledge that past and have conversations with the community and say, we're not doing that here. We have protections in place, where officers are well trained. One of the things that Chief Bill Bones has done here in Boise is he takes his new law enforcement officers to the Anne Frank Memorial so they can talk about human rights and how important all of that is. And so I think that having that conversation continue, to recognize that. And then I think community members need to understand how difficult a job law enforcement officers have, and that we both really have an interest in understanding each side's perspective in order to keep the community safe. And people in the community have an interest if there's just for an example, a drug house down the street or gang shootings down the street, they have an interest in law enforcement officers coming in and having a very strong presence in the community to deter that kind of activity. And I think that's what every community wants, but they want those officers to do so within the bounds of the Constitution and the bounds of the law. And I think we need to continue to have that dialogue. Yesterday morning, I had the opportunity to be present at Congressman Simpson's office when he presented the Congressional Badge of Bravery to FBI Special Agent Rod Draper, who is now based here in Boise, but was on the hostage rescue team a few years ago, and for a period of about 5 years before he relocated to the Boise office. And he received the Congressional Badge of Bravery for an incident. He was involved in a hostage rescue in January of 2013 in it was Midland, Alabama. An incident that got a fair amount of publicity was a guy stopped a school bus, took a 5-year-old boy off the school bus, killed the driver of the bus, holed up in a bunker that he had created, and held the boy there for a period of time. There was some concern that he would, they had the hostage negotiators there, they had the hostage rescue team assembled. They reached a point where they were concerned for the hostage's safety, didn't think they would be able to talk him out. So the hostage rescue team made an entrance into this bunker underground. There was improvised explosive device that was set off. They dropped 10 feet, and they were able to rescue the little boy. The kidnapper was killed, and none of them were injured. So it's these 5 FBI agents who totally put their lives on the line to free this little boy and to deal with a very dangerous person. And that's what we ask law enforcement officers to do. And I think we as community members need to understand that as well. So there needs to be some understanding really from both sides.
Is there a way to get more of that transparency in there? I mean, hearing the stories of, the heroism and the difficulty of that, and then maybe hearing some of getting a catharsis from a trial on an officer that maybe didn't act appropriately. Is there a way to get more transparency on that entire process so that we as citizens at home can't assume all cops are bad or all cops are good, to know a little bit more about the nuance?
Well, I think, the leaders of the organizations, I mean, my office, I think, has a responsibility to make known how this works from both sides. I think the heads of law enforcement agencies have that responsibility. I mean, I think the media plays a role in covering all sides of that issue and really asking hard questions. And then I think it would be helpful if, to the extent, and I understand why it's difficult, particularly for communities who feel over a long period of time that they have been treated badly by law enforcement, but people need to take a step back and try to be as reasonable and rational as they can in evaluating any specific circumstance. And I think that, to the credit of the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, and Eric Holder, her predecessor, they have really dived into this building community trust, particularly to communities where there's been a history of tension between law enforcement and it's typically minority communities over long periods of time, and trying to get everyone to sit down in a room and have the important discussions and try to create some of that transparency. And it's, I think, real important to bring young people into that discussion and to try to build communities where young people can view law enforcement officers as individuals to be trusted, that people that they would want to seek out and have relationships with, aside from having that unfortunate relationship that you have with them, either when you've done something wrong or with an occasional going over the speed limit and driving. Those are the not fun interactions with law enforcement. So I think we need to have more opportunities for constructive law enforcement interaction.
Is that something that has happened or needs to happen specifically in Idaho also?
I think it needs to happen everywhere, and we've started talking about it among our law enforcement partners. There's been some community outreach. I think that the law enforcement agencies in the Treasure Valley overall do a very good job of community outreach. There's always more that can be done, but I think the conversation needs to go on everywhere so that we don't get to the point that they were in Ferguson, Missouri, where there was absolute mistrust between the community and law enforcement. It's like any relationship, it needs to be worked on pretty regularly. And I think there are good opportunities for that in the Treasure Valley and in Idaho. I mean, Idaho is overall a relatively small and rural state. If your kids play sports, you're playing with some cops' kids, you're playing with some prosecutors' kids. You have an opportunity on the sidelines to visit with those folks. I think I'm hopeful that our school resource officer programs are programs that are providing resources to the schools and not seen as like the disciplinarians or the eyes for discipline in the schools. And so I think it needs to go on everywhere. I think we have opportunities here to pursue that. I mean, certainly there are going to be parts of the community and some law enforcement agencies that don't do it as well, but it's a conversation that we need to have here, and I think law enforcement agencies here are receptive to it. It's something that I talk about every time I meet with chiefs of police, and now when I meet with community groups.
Is it healthy, though, to have a little bit of distrust for that authority and knowing your rights and going into a situation a little bit guarded? And I'm thinking about this as a citizen and as an Idahoan and as a journalist who automatically is kind of anti-authoritarian sometimes. Really, is it possible? Is it healthy to have that distrust, and is it possible to have that distrust and still have a healthy balance?
I think, I'm not sure I think it's, healthy to have a distrust. I think it's healthy to ask questions. I mean, I think it's always healthy to ask questions. And I think that having tensions between different entities within our society are good. I think it's good for journalists to ask questions of law enforcement entities, of government entities, because it's very easy, I think, when you get in just with law enforcement agencies or government entities to not be as objective as you need to be because you're convinced that your mission is right. And it's important to open yourself up to skepticism and to questioning. And so I think distrust I think is too strong. I'm not sure that distrust is particularly healthy, but questioning is very, very healthy. And I think I think that bringing new people into organizations, to government organizations, I think it's one of the beauties of the way the Department of Justice works with U.S. Attorney's offices at the beginning of a new administration. Bring new people in, ask questions, question why you're doing things. But distrust, I think unless it's earned, it's probably not healthy.
And on that distrust level, and Brad's probably on the front line of this right now, we're trying to figure out how many people have been involved in officer-involved shootings over the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been significant pushback on folks being like, no, we can't get that number unless you give us $1,400 for our public records request, because it's going to be like all these man hours and going through data. And,
like just a couple.
Yeah,
But
well, but enough that it's
Right.
Yeah.
And nationwide, the Guardian's doing a lot of reporting, Nate Silver's doing a lot of reporting on. We just don't know how many people
Right.
are being, are involved in these things. Why? We have a law that says the FBI is supposed to collect this data. It seemingly hasn't really been enforced, and the law enforcement agencies themselves aren't readily
Right.
turning it over. Like, what's the disconnect? Like, why is it so mind-boggling to me that we don't know this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that we need to do a better job of collecting that data, and it's certainly a significant part of the conversation that's going on internally within the Department of Justice and how to approach this building community trust ongoing project that the Attorney General, the current Attorney General, and her predecessor have implemented. Is how do we go about meaningfully collecting those numbers? And how do we, give some, put some meat on the bones of this law that Congress enacted and wanted the FBI to collect that? And it is a practical and a resource problem as well, because if there's not a box that you have to check in a database that you can go back and search, collecting data is a pretty challenging issue. And when you're talking about how far back are you going to go, in my view, going forward, we should definitely have a mechanism for capturing that. If we didn't do it well in the past, let's at least say we didn't do it well in the past and try to collect it, going forward. I can tell you that sometimes within our office, when we're asked to provide data and count things, and we go back and look, we don't have a data collection system for what we do. What we have is a case management system in which data is collected. So we can sometimes search that that case management system to get certain information, but it's not great at collecting. If we didn't think to capture that information, it's not great in going back and collecting it. We, just for purposes of record keeping, sometimes we don't create systems that do that very well. So I think going forward, we can solve that problem. Going back, it is going to be particularly challenging and time consuming, and agencies will have to make the decision about whether they want to allocate people to that or not. And I suspect if the public and the media keep putting pressure on them, then they will.
And excuse me for kind of how blunt this question is going to be worded,
Right.
but if we don't even know how many of these incidents there are, how can we honestly know that they were all justified?
Well, I don't think that we can, I think you'd have to, it's hard, it is hard to say. I don't think anyone can now say we think everything was justified. I think if you went back and counted the number of instances, then you'd have to count, okay, what happened here? Was it referred for investigation? I know best obviously about the federal system. Was it referred for investigation by the FBI? Did they do an initial investigation or a preliminary investigation? Was there more investigation? Was there a grand jury investigation? Were charges brought? What was the result of those charges being brought? I think we're at a point where there's going to be going forward we'll be able to do that, but going back is particularly challenging. I think what you're going to probably have a fair amount of success with is people remembering what they've done. I mean, more anecdotally. I mean, I know that in this office, or I recall at this point, that we have charged 3 law enforcement officer misconduct cases, or at least I had 3 law enforcement officer misconduct cases. 2 of those went to trial and the defendants were acquitted. 1 person pled guilty prior to trial. So that's, none of them were officer-involved shooting. They were law enforcement officers charged with using more force than was necessary, but not by shooting an individual.
Kind of along those lines, there's a high threshold for prosecution. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond,
I mean, again,
are you guys
That was
ready
almost
yet?
perfect timing.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
I mean, with the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt is the same one we have in all criminal cases, and I think it's entirely appropriate. That was a decision that was made, hundreds of years ago about how our criminal justice system ought to operate, and it is a very principled decision that we're not going to let the government punish or imprison somebody unless they can be proved guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. A choice made hundreds of years ago. You would rather have, what is it, the same when I have 10 guilty people go free than convict 1 innocent. We know even then that it's not, the system doesn't work perfectly. I think it works pretty well, but it doesn't work perfectly. So when you have a situation where you say, okay, maybe in this particular case, you can say just objectively, more force was used than necessary. The officer didn't intend it, but more force was used than was necessary. Well, I think there's sort of 2 responses to that. We do give law enforcement officers a buffer zone, so to speak, because they're making decisions most of the time in very rapidly evolving situations under less than ideal conditions. It may be nighttime, it may be after a high-speed chase, it may be where there was some sort of flash or gunfire or something. They may be going into a difficult situation where they know or have information that the person inside has killed multiple other individuals. And so we give them some room to make mistakes. So in those cases, I'm not sure that we would want anything to, I don't think we want to put the bar down so low, certainly on where there's a really, really significant penalty in those sorts of situations, because we don't want officers to be so cautious that they're not going to be able to do their job. Training, I think, is absolutely critical in trying to reduce the number of mistakes that we have and to try to make sure law enforcement agencies have appropriate policies so that they can do the very best they can of walking this line of protecting the public and not infringing on civil rights and civil liberties. Every single officer needs to know where that line is. And you talked earlier, you asked a question earlier about distrust and shouldn't people know what their rights are? Absolutely, people should know what their rights are. But the law enforcement officers should absolutely know what their rights are. And they should not be doing things, I mean, they need to be well trained. Don't ask someone for their driver's license, if that's not a situation where you're entitled to ask them for their driver's license. Don't stop a car just because you want to stop a car. Make sure that you're following the law and following procedure and following policy within your department. And repeated training, over and over and over again, not just not just in the academy and your first time out, but those things need to be reinforced. Policies need to be reinforced. There needs to be a culture within that department. So training, I think, is absolutely critical there. And then there are vehicles for people who have maybe where excessive force has been used and there's not proof that it was willful or intentional and there's not a criminal violation. There are civil remedies that are available. In federal cases, you can bring Bivens lawsuits. You can bring 42 U.S.C. 1983 lawsuits. And the only difference between those two depends on whether the officer was a federal officer or a state officer. And the burden of proof is not as high. And then you're in the civil arena, and it's a different construct. So there are other tools that are available and that are out there. There is also the federal government has a civil tool available to it, a pattern and practice lawsuit under Title 42 United States Code Section 14141, a relatively new statute enforced primarily by the Special Litigation Unit of the Civil Rights Division, but U.S. Attorney's offices are often involved, where the law enforcement agency has a pattern or practice of using more force than is necessary, of detaining people when they shouldn't detain people. Then the Department of Justice can come in, do an investigation, and typically those are resolved by the law enforcement agency and the Department of Justice entering into a consent decree where the law enforcement agency agrees to undertake certain reforms. There's a lot of training, change their policies, and then it's monitored over a period of time by a court-appointed monitor. That's what's going to happen in Ferguson, Missouri, the Seattle Police Department, Cleveland, Ohio. So that's another tool that is available when it's widespread practice within the department. And then there are also, the agencies have tools available to them. If you have a robust internal affairs department that will take a look at law enforcement officer behavior in a particular case and say, look, this may not have been criminal, but this was bad conduct by you. We're going to take action to discipline you. You're going to sit for a week, whatever their agency policy is. We need to expect law enforcement agencies to be robust in their internal affairs policies and their administrative discipline. And sometimes when I speak to law enforcement agencies about the work the department does, I said we would much rather you take care of your problem officers than we have to. And I think that serves the public very well as well. If you know that the law enforcement agency, if you go to complain to a law enforcement agency and someone has misbehaved, that the law enforcement agency is going to take care of it. And that I think that will help with the community trust as well.
Kind of along those lines, when I first got into journalism here, I heard a story quite a few times, and it might be kind of apocryphal or a little embellished, but that there was either a sheriff or a police chief that stood outside of the Channel 2 station and over a dead body and said, this is what happens when you pull a weapon on a lawman in Idaho. And that then led to the ombudsman kind of being created, and you went from what, at least from the stories, I was not here at the time, and haven't done a whole lot of research, what seemed like kind of a little era of the Wild West playing out right here in Boise to what seems like now a system that has checks and balances and accountability in it. And it's, from the outside, it looks like they made some great strides. But not all towns have that ombudsman
right.
there. Like, are there lessons that other cities and counties can learn from that, what Boise did?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the challenges that law enforcement agencies have in Idaho is most of them are very small. So having being able to separately appoint or hire somebody as the ombudsman, or like the city has now hired Natalie Camacho Mendoza as the head of their police oversight board, may not be an option, but it's probably the best option. And if they can find the way to do that, then it's certainly helpful. It gives more confidence, I think, to the public if there's someone that they can go to who may seem relatively independent within the agency or independent from the agency. And I think that one of the tools that is helpful is if they can publish a report periodically about what they did and what they've done, so that the public knows that they've been receptive. I know that one of the frustrations people often have dealing with government agencies, certainly dealing with prosecuting agencies and law enforcement agencies, is they provide information and then they never hear from anybody again. And that's, to a certain extent, there are reasons for that. I mean, we get information, we sometimes tell people it's a one-way street because we don't typically, if it's an ongoing investigation, provide information about what we're doing in the investigation outside the investigation for a variety of reasons, including privacy of the people being investigated. If it turns out not to be criminal conduct, you don't want that to play out in public because it's harder sometimes to get information if there's a lot of information out there about your investigation. But in some way providing information about what you're doing, I think helps all government agencies and certainly helps law enforcement agencies. So through the extent ombudsman or police oversight boards or even a law enforcement agency can periodically say, okay, we had this many complaints, we've investigated them all, we found that there were 3 were well-founded, and this is the discipline we imposed, or we added additional training because of this, then I think that would help the community's confidence in the law enforcement agency.
And We know that you're getting low on time and it's gonna take us a bit to tear down, so.
Yeah, let me just ask one last thing on this. Basically, is there something missing from the conversation here in Idaho? Is there something we should be talking about that we're not, or is there something that's off base that's involved in kind of how we've been asking you?
No, I don't think that there's anything necessarily missing from the conversation, but I think it's important to have the conversation. I think it would be a mistake in this national climate and what's going on in other parts of the country for Idaho not to have a conversation about the relationship between its law enforcement agencies, between its prosecuting agencies, and the public that it serves. And if we have that conversation, if we have that dialogue, and it turns out we're doing overall a great job, but we need to improve in some areas, I think that's critical. If it turns out we have that conversation and we in law enforcement and prosecution are mistaken about the kind of job we're doing, that's helpful. One of the things that I've been tasked with doing and have enjoyed doing very much as U.S. Attorney is I meet with the tribal business councils of all of the tribes that are located in Idaho once a year. And one of the things I tell them is, in I tell them, I want to know what I'm doing wrong. A lot of times people will tell you, oh, you're doing great, or you did great on this case. I said, I also want to know, what am I doing wrong? Because you don't get any better if everyone tells you you're doing great. And so, and some things we can fix and some things we can't. But knowing where your shortcomings are, where people think your shortcomings are, is a lot more helpful than hearing everything's great.
I'm curious, what
Yeah,
do you
exactly. You open yourself up to this.
Right.
What are you doing wrong?
Or what do people think the office is doing wrong?
Well, I think that I think that people, certainly when we meet with the reservations, I think they would like to have, they would like to see us do more. I think that when your response is, well, we only have so many people and it takes a long time to do a case, and I think that's always a fair criticism of the federal system, in particular on the criminal justice side. It takes us a long time. I like to say we're very deliberate and thorough. Some people say slow. So we can look at our processes, we can put in ticklers and say, what's going on in this case? And particularly if it's a case where there are victims, individual victims rather than entity victims. What are we doing to move those cases forward? I think it's a fair criticism. It's not to say people don't work hard, but what can we do to improve the pace that we have? Where can we find more resources? Is there a case that we missed is there a case that we missed for whatever reason? Is there something we didn't communicate, but maybe we didn't move that case? Is there something we didn't communicate about back to the tribe and back to the business council?
So you have to be out of here by 3:30, right?
Right.
Right. Do you have anything else?
And even if it's close, I can go do the calls and just in another room, and if my assistant's here, she can
I
just.
always worry because it always takes us a while to unpack or pack up.
Because I had two questions on a totally different topic that I wanted to hit here.
Okay.
Just quickly, you mentioned the how if there is an officer involved shooting, it goes to a different agency. Do you think that's enough to investigate it? Do you think that's enough of a safeguard? Because you were talking with the ombudsman or the oversight committees. There's other entities doing that. Do you think that there should be a further separation in who investigates those cases?
Well, I think it's a very good process to have someone from outside the agency. I know there are other concerns. Well, it's still police officers investigating police officers, but those are the people who are trained to do investigations. And I think at a certain level we have to, for any governmental agency to operate, for law enforcement agencies to operate, we have to rely on the integrity of the people who are doing that job, and that's why it's important to have the oversight from journalists, from the media. That's why it's important to ask the questions. But it's important for those of us who are in leadership positions, to make sure that's what we're looking for when we hire people. We want to put people of integrity in those positions so that they can make decisions and explain them in a way that the public will understand. Because I'm not sure who you would go to beyond that. I'm not sure it's. I've heard some talk about wanting to have sort of these independent bodies to look into the police. Well, is that really going to be an effective use of taxpayer dollars with all the other competing concerns that we have? Are those individuals going to, if their job is to investigate police officers and that's it, will they become sort of look at it with a more skeptical eye than you ordinarily would want. If you have trained law enforcement officers looking at these cases, whether they're FBI agents or police officers doing their jobs, they should be able to get, the evidence is going to be what it is, and then if it's referred then to a prosecutor who's in a separate office, then they should be able to make those decisions based on the evidence. It's what we're trained to do. It's what we should do. It's, if someone has a conflict, then we have to hope that they will recuse themselves.
You can.
Oh, no, you can.
And I guess the other thing, since you were talking about a lot about the differing burdens to start a case or to actually continued on, are tools like body cameras and cell phone videos, I mean, those are obviously popping up and certainly in the media because then we have something we can show. I mean, are those helpful in bridging that gap at all? Are there other tools that could help, just create more evidence so people would know if a case, if there was enough burden of proof to get to a case?
Yeah, I think the body-worn cameras or video is obvious. It's nice to have a recording of whatever it is that happened. I mean, it's not always dispositive, but it's nice to have those particular tools. I think sort of more importantly and more critically is having people with a critical eye who are experienced in making judgments about what kind of evidence you need to meet the elements of a particular crime. I think that federally, the Justice Department does a very good job of looking at these cases, and it's set up where you have the FBI investigates, so they are typically a very independent body, and their practice has been if there is an incident that occurs where the local FBI is very close with the agency, they will have agents from a different office or a different location come and do the investigation to be as independent as possible. And then you have two prosecution offices, even though we're both part of the Department of Justice, looking at the case. You have the U.S. Attorney's Office, which is in the location, knows the lay of the land, understands what is going on locally, and then you have the Civil Rights Division, the criminal section, who has professional prosecutors whose job it is to look at complaints like this all the time, and they have sort of the whole body of cases that they can look at and say, this is sufficient evidence. This is not. They've sort of heard it all, so to speak. So you're not necessarily going to be snowed by something a law enforcement officer says. They're familiar with the tools that can be used to gather evidence in those kinds of cases and what's persuasive to get law enforcement officers to cooperate against other law enforcement officers if there is somebody who's engaged in bad conduct. So I think having those people who can evaluate the evidence, who can evaluate what you get on a body-worn camera. And the body-worn cameras provide some, they're I think a real good practical tool if used appropriately by a law enforcement agency, because they will capture the interaction and more often than not, they're going to be helpful to the officer in an interaction. Because if someone comes in and alleges bad behavior, and the law enforcement officer, was polite when they issued the ticket, then they just can look at that. And when a law enforcement officer misbehaves, and I think we've seen plenty of video now where the law enforcement officer has misbehaved and not been as candid about it, then they can, national situations, then the body-worn cameras there have provided a piece of evidence that wasn't previously available.
Okay.
Perfect, thank you.
If I catch you off guard with this, I was going to bring this up and then totally spaced it.
Okay.
When we were on the phone.
I don't even know what you're going to bring
So
up. This
feel
is
free.
this is
exciting.
yeah.
No, this is
Ooh.
a different story that we're working on. So we were sitting down with Steve Yates, and we're going to sit down with Jim Risch. Yates was involved in the Patriot Act at the beginning. Risch is obviously involved in national security and national intelligence gathering now. I'm kind of on what's happened with these large data collection nets and things like that. A lot of the times, a criticism is you just end up with noise. You don't end up with usable data that you can actually use for prosecution. What have you found? Has that data come to you and helped prosecutions?
Well, I think it's a very, very broad question, and probably it's impossible for me to answer without saying things I ought not say.
That's what I was worried about. could we talk to you later about that?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
I
and
was
I'll-
wondering if that hit a little too close to home right now.
Yeah, and it's also, that's also the kind of topic that, as I've also often told people, I'm sort of a middle manager in a very big company, and this is one we would have to ask, there's nothing more sort of sensitive than the national security area in terms of talking points out of injustice, so.
Oh, and just so you know, like my interest later on, if you can talk about it later on, is like not whether or not it's worth doing, not whether any of that, but just when it gets to your level of actually trying to prosecute a crime, like
How
how
much of that
much
do you
that data is
use?
useful, or how much does it come into the whole thing? That's
Yeah, what might be more interesting, because it comes up very rarely, but there is a lot of lawful data collection that goes on that's not sort of the bulk telephony data that the Patriot Act was concerned with being. We, through lawful process, collect a lot of information within the United States on Title IIIs in criminal cases, people using their phones to plan drug deals. You have to get it has to be approved through an office at Main Justice, has to be signed off on by the judge, has to be, if you're going beyond the 30 days, you have to get it renewed again. So there's all sorts of court oversight and court authorization on stuff like that. And then and there's requirements to, with the Title III, with the wiretap to minimize. So if you're up on a wiretap, it's a drug case, and they start talking about what clothes they're going to buy for their girlfriend at, Pink or whatever it's called now, Victoria's Secret, then you have to stop listening. And so there are all sorts of rules about how you do that. And those are the kinds of things that get used pretty regularly in federal criminal cases. We can get search warrants for historical email records, or there's various processes you go through to get the information that is court approved and court authorized, or where you have to, some you can get with a grand jury subpoena, some certain kinds of orders, some you need a search warrant for. So there's all these processes depending on how you're going to get the information. And so, those things are used much more readily than any of the more sort of national security type data collection procedures that require a lot more authorization both through the department and that Congress spends a lot of its time on.
Would you couch that in the same debate and in the same light as the bulk data collection? Because they're collected through different processes.
Right, right.
You don't have a court order with the bulk data, and that's part of the big part of the debate. But would you say that the data that you do use, the things that you do use, is an important part of national security as well?
Well, it's an important part certainly of enforcing federal prosecuting criminal cases federally on a day-to-day basis. I mean, that's really what we do. And most criminal cases now involve some sort of digital information. I mean, everybody is using, whether it's a phone or their computer. That's just the way. It's the way we all do. It's the way we live. It's the way we all do business. So trying to make sure that we comply with the Fourth Amendment, sort of that changing world. That's one of the challenges that we have, and that's what we do on a regular basis. I think that has more of an impact on sort of this conversation between civil liberties and making sure that we keep the public safe.
If the Founding Fathers had smartphones, how differently do you think they would have shaped that Fourth Amendment?
I don't know. I actually think that they did a pretty amazing job with the Fourth Amendment, and with there should be no unreasonable searches and seizures unless upon a warrant. And since then, it's been the Supreme Court that has interpreted what that means in light of changing times and changing technology. I mean, I think maybe a more it's a different question, and the new Supreme Court has had to answer it. Is when they did the Katz case with the telephone booth, would they have done that differently if they had known about the smartphone? I mean, it becomes I think a challenge for all of us to try to figure out what that means in light of changing technology and changing times. And when you have law enforcement officers and prosecution offices that are trying to stop drug traffickers from bringing in to Idaho the most potent meth that we've seen, way more potent than we used to have our little homegrown labs that are this meth that's built in these huge drug labs in Mexico. We want to make sure we use every tool we think is lawfully available to us to identify those folks and get the meth out of there. When we have people who are child sexual predators who figure out every kind of new computer technology and internet systems to trade child porn and to hide it or to disguise their fraud or hack into our systems and put them on the dark side of the internet. We want to be able to use the tools that are available to us and our best judgment under the law to try to track those folks down. And so I think that's what we should expect from law enforcement.
I've got one last question, and I'm imagining Melissa's going to do the question that we ask everybody. And this, when we think of people struggling with like ethical kind of dilemmas of privacy versus security, that sort of stuff, we kind of think of like congressmen and judges and maybe people and professors in college. Do you struggle with that? I mean, do you have moments where you're like, I don't know if this is the right thing to do?
I think absolutely. I think that's. But when we have those struggles, both in prosecutors' offices and in law enforcement agencies, it's within the confines of a particular case and looking at a particular factual situation. Can we use, this technique here? And in some cases, the Department of Justice will look sort of writ large at with this new technology. How does the Fourth Amendment apply here? And those are discussions that are held primarily internally, and if it gets used, you all find out about it, and if it doesn't, no one finds out about it. So I think, and we have constant training on Fourth Amendment and our other things that we're obligated to do, discovery, to try to make sure that we're complying with the law. And then we see how it, if a defense attorney challenges it, we see how it plays out in the court, and if court decisions come out and say, no, you can't do that, then we have to change our practices. But the debate definitely goes on in prosecution offices, in this office, and in law enforcement agencies about whether to use a technique and whether it's appropriate.
So, you're an attorney, you're a citizen, you're a mother, everything in your life. What keeps you up at night?
Oh, wow. What keeps me up at night? Honestly, it tends to be much more the parenting issues and what my kids are doing than I actually find, because of, I find doing this job really, I wouldn't say easy, but it doesn't really keep me up at night.
Why? You've got some weighty issues.
Well, there are a couple of reasons, I think, really. I think, part of it is a control thing. When, especially my kids are now 16 and 13, and there's, you spend your entire parenting career, I think, giving up control of what's going on in your child's life, and so you just have to listen and see what it is that they're doing and hope that it's all going well. You don't have control over their teachers, their friends. When my 16-year-old now has her driver's license, you don't have control of the other drivers, and so there's a lot of that constant worry. And then I think the second thing is, in all honesty, since I worked on that Duncan case, and so much that happened in that case professionally was so disturbing that after that, nothing just seems that